Welcome to the Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Treana Peake has devoted her life to spreading the care that she experienced in her small town Albertan upbringing around the world. As a philanthropist first and a retailer second, Obakki has become a space for both utilizing and transforming the structures of traditional retail. Obakki is a purpose-led lifestyle brand that connects people through modern design. This online and Vancouver-based brick-and-mortar retail brand offers homeware products made by the artisans all over the world while upholding three principles: sustainability, traceability, and ethical production. On this episode of The Voice of Retail, I sit down with Treana, talk about the story of Obakki, how she fosters a symbiotic relationship between philanthropy and retail, and how she manages intricate supply chains as an independent retailer in unprecedented times.
I measure success in the lives of the people, that we impact. And my artisan goals are my goals as a company. And I think I'm in a unique position because we are so purpose-driven that the bottom line, of course, we need to make money in order to reach more artisans and do more work.
Let's listen in now. Treana, welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining me so early in the morning. You and I were chatting off mic. It was kind of funny as these things go, and you just arrived, and the system was connecting, and I could hear you drop your keys to the door, and you were ready to go. So thank you for taking the time to join me before your day gets busy and talk about all things retail, all things about what you do. You've got a fascinating origin story, and you're doing some amazing things. So I'm really excited to learn more and get in. Let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about your origin story, a bit about yourself and how you got into doing what you're doing, and of course, how you got into retail.
Yeah, well, I'm a Albertan girl, small town girl. I grew up in a little tiny town called Hannah, and I think we had maybe 2,500 people in our town. So I think at that age, I really started being quite philanthropic. So I was more about, getting into regions of the world, hosting fundraisers, going to Africa, going to Romania, going to all these different places. And so really, I started in philanthropy, not in retail. When we ended up moving to Vancouver, I thought, you know what, I'm going to start Obakki, which is my retail brand. And because I'm a creative person and I saw a need in the market, and I thought it could be a really great brand to build from scratch. And, over time, I ended up taking Obakki and Obakki Foundation, which is a philanthropic counterpart, and kind of merging them together, which has really led me to where I am today. It's quite an interesting smash up of two worlds, if you'd say.
Right on. Now, let's talk about, let me pull on a few threads in there, so to speak, why that part of the world, what interests you. There's lots of parts of the world you could have been interested in, and what do you think sparked in your life that kind of desire to help people, basically. And then we'll get to the retail part, because I'm super interested in that as well.
Sure. So, as a young child in that small town, it was my mom and I, and, we lived together in this home, and we were struggling to make ends meet, as many families do. But there was this stranger who would slip a white envelope of money under our door every year. And I remember being a really, really young child and seeing that money come through and looking at the envelope. And to me, it was less about the money that was inside, although that was something that, would make my mom, really happy every year, of course, and take the pressure off and the stress off of her. But, I just sit and stare at that envelope and go, who is this person? And why is it an unmarked letter? And why can I not thank the person who's dropped it off? And so for me, I just started to focus on what type of person that was that would do something year after year to help a family and not expect anything back in return. And so I think really as a young child, that started to form who I wanted to be as a person. And I really like that idea of not being able to close that loop of giving, because it makes you as a person go, okay, I was really grateful to receive that. I'm very lucky to receive that. But now what do I do with all of that? I can't go back to that person and say, okay, thank you. And the loop is closed. It, in a way, without sounding cliche, I wanted to pay that forward. I wanted to find ways to carry that on throughout my own life. And so that really did set the way and pave the way for my life of philanthropy.
Wow. So interesting. I mean, I often talk to retailers about this intersection of the personal and the professional, but you're really making that come to life. Now, why parts of Africa? What interested you about, and I think you do the work in particular countries. So unpack that for me a little bit.
Right. So Africa was just a place where I started. I mean, I was going to Romania and some other countries, traveling really young, doing fundraisers, that sort of thing. And Africa was an interesting one because we had formed this small nonprofit, and it was kind of a no-name nonprofit, but we did have a website and a horrible graphic. And, I don't even think anyone went to visit us except one man from the middle of the jungle in Cameroon, actually, in a village, really rural village called Lewa. His name was Lucky Tombo, and he went to our website and sent us a message and said, "Hey, I'm seeing you're doing great things in the world. Why don't you come visit my village? We don't have any water. We don't have a school. We don't have healthcare. What do you think?" And so it was me and a friend of mine. And I'm like, all right, let's go. So here we go. I sold my car, and because that's the only way I could afford. So
wait. You get some person at this point named Lucky, who was clearly lucky, as it turned out, just reaches out to you, and you sell your car and go. Right? Is this what you're telling me?
Yes. And I do not want people to start emailing me after this podcast because I don't do that anymore. However,
to be quite clear, you like your car. You like the car you've got.
That's really how it started. And so I sold my car. We went there. We hiked and trekked for days to get to this village. And that's where we started. And actually, Lucky Tombo is now the Minister of Education in Cameroon. He's like, it's just, and here I am doing this. And, it was quite an amazing journey that we all took together. But we brought clean water to the village. We brought schools to the village. And really then the village took it from there. And when you go back now, it's just this thriving metropolis. Where
just needed a bit of help, right? Just needed a hand up.
Just a couple doors open. That's really all we did. But
Fantastic. All right. Well, let's talk about Obakki. Let's get into this retail thing. How you go to market? What's your typical customer look like? Talk about your assortment. So there's a whole story there. Unpack that for the listeners.
Right. So really, coming from a background in philanthropy and development, I spent 30 years traveling the globe, going to South Sudan, Uganda, refugee zones, Mali, all these different regions of the world, continuing to do philanthropy. And in doing so, I had a fashion brand, Obakki, and it was purely, we were showcasing all over the world and wholesaling, and we had our own retail location. And when I was in these villages, I started to see these artisans who, we were primarily doing water wells. But then once we started doing water, you started to see the economy start to shift a little bit, and women would start to plant gardens, or women would start to go back to their traditional craft. And so
get beyond survival, basically. So open up to do other things, right?
Exactly. And so I started, I'd be in the middle of a rural village in the middle of nowhere, and someone would come out with this amazing pot, ceramic, based pot. And I'd be like, wow, those are incredible. Where are you selling those? And so I worked with the foundation to establish their local market so that they'd be sustainable with or without us. But then once, my Obakki Foundation had been able to help bridge some of those local gaps, then Obakki Designs, my retail fashion company, design company, started buying product. And that's kind of led us to where we are today. We're working with, artisans, 36 different artisan groups from around the world, but that's thousands and thousands of artisans. We're spread out throughout Mexico now, 18 different states. We're all over Africa. And, but we're also working with artisans, traditional artisans from Italy or from Japan. So there's this culmination of all of these different incredible artisans as we've shifted a little more into homeware. So every piece, every product we sell is, something, that comes with a story. It's a story of the person who made it. And I think in retail, for me, as I was doing clothing and touching every piece myself, I just started to look at what these new consumers want and what do I want as a consumer, and realizing that, some of these pieces that I gather and keep in my home, I love aesthetically, but I don't know the backstory to it.
Right.
And I have no personal attachment to it.
Yeah.
And so in retail, for me now, it's a shift focus for this conscious consumer and to bring more meaning into people's homes. So when you walk by a bowl, you go, oh, I know Amadou made that. And he's from, northern Mali. And it took him 1 week to do this. And, here's a little bit about him and his culture. And you know who it is behind each product.
Now, you've been doing this for a while. Lots of questions. And I'm curious about the impact that you think the COVID era will have on this idea of meaning in product. So, I did this session with Google Canada yesterday, and we were talking, they wanted to know what I thought about what retail would look like in 3 to 5 years. And I said, I don't know what it's going to look like in 3 to 5 months some days. But, one of the things that would seem to be the case is that people look for more meaning, more sustainability, more accountability in the products. Have you seen, and my theory was that this COVID era has actually, if there's a benefit to all of this, it's kind of raised our awareness about the interconnectivity of the world, and maybe we should have more meaning to the things that we live with. Have you seen a movement? Because it's been around a long time. It's a notoriously difficult retail concept to crack the code on. I want to talk about that a little later. But are you thinking more and more consumers are going to be readjusting their thoughts around what they buy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly seeing it. I know that we're maybe filling a niche. However, we've seen a huge uptick in sales. We're relatively new to the homewares department. We stopped doing as much fashion as we were doing before, even though we did all of our own local manufacturing, and we've won eco sustainability awards, that kind of thing. I still felt like there was a strong negative footprint in what I was doing, even though we had controlled as many aspects of it as we could. And so hence the shift to these handmade, artisan-driven products that actually create an impact for people and communities and have a negative impact on the environment or do no damage to the environment. And so when we did that shift, we had so many people come out and just say, this is what I've been looking for, because I think with a consumer-driven mind, like we're all buying things, but you don't want to be buying things that is having a negative impact. And so, for me as a company, we're small enough and we're impact-driven and purpose-driven that I'm out in the field meeting artisans. I'm making sure that I know we're not doing damage to the community or the individual that's creating it, and no damage to the environment. And I continue to check up on that, and everything's made, in partnership with these people. And so when our customer comes to us, they can go, oh, okay, I actually trust this company, and I trust that they've done the due diligence and the research behind this particular product, that I can buy it guilt-free. In fact, I can buy it and know that I'm creating impact somewhere in the world. And so that's a really hard thing for a consumer to be able to find. And that's my promise, or my goal, is to be able to check off as many of those boxes for our consumers so that the homework side of it is done. And so to your point, yes, I do feel like there's a whole wave of people that want to make sure that they're not contributing to something negative and buying less.
Or at least trying to understand it. I interviewed Sir Ronald Cohn, who's kind of a leader of the ESG movement, at least in investment banking. And he was telling me about apps now where you could scan items on the shelf and understand their actual impact. What the economists would call economic rents behind the product. The concept that you're talking about, unique, is not exactly the first time retailers have tried to do the similar thing. And it's notoriously complex from a supply chain and from a consistency and from a vendor. And you talked about, checking in to make sure everything's cool. Talk about that, because that to me is where a lot can trip up, right? I mean, supply chain is really hard right now to begin with, no matter what you're selling, just in the way it is today. How do you manage? Like, what things do you do to keep the product, find the product, keep it coming, and talk about that?
Right. It's incredibly hard. I have a lot of friends in business that run very successful companies, and they're like, Treana, you can't do this. This doesn't make any sense. Like, how are you ever going to grow and expand and become this, leading company in the world? I'm like, that's not my goal anyway. I measure success in the lives of the people, that we impact. And my artisan goals are my goals as a company. And I think I'm in a unique position because we are so purpose driven that the bottom line, of course, we need to make money in order to reach more artisans and do more work and to keep this company moving forward. But we're not bottom line driven. We're, we're able to use and work within this unique model, because there are other motivations or other reasons here at play. Supply chain is incredibly difficult. I think with COVID for us, though, it was quite interesting because more than ever, our artisans needed our support. And, a lot of these rural communities were on lockdown and are still on lockdown. I mean, South Sudan is 0.04% of the population is vaccinated. And so the country's on lockdown. And
they had a long road ahead of them, too. And they have, some of these countries have a long road ahead of them. So this isn't a short-term issue for you or them, right?
No, it isn't. And I think like for us, nothing was made in a factory. So nothing shut down. In fact, people needed to create more in order to sustain their family or their village. And so, we kept going through that. But of course, we had all the logistical issues of getting the product here. And of course, I had to halt a lot of my philanthropic trips during that time as well. So luckily, in a lot of these countries, I have, contacts or I'm running foundation programs anyway. So I've got field staff on the ground and people were my eyes and ears, as we continued to add artisans, even though I haven't been there in a couple villages myself. I'm about to get on a plane and head there in October and again in November. Now
will that be your first trip in a long time?
I did go during the pandemic into the refugee area and into South Sudan, only because our work is so important to keep moving forward. We're doing water wells and beekeeping and livelihood initiatives and all other sorts of things in addition to the artisan goods. So, I chose one trip and I kept it as safe as I could. But I've definitely scaled back, and that's been difficult for sure. Yeah.
Well, I talked to a lot of merchants who of course, are different commodities, but are in a similar boat and have found that maintaining relationships with their existing vendors, if we can call them all that, has actually been easier. Like, with Zoom and technology, are you able to take advantage of those things? You say you have people on the ground. Some of that technology's been around before COVID in the before time, but it seems to be more, from a business culture perspective, seems to be more applicable. Again, here I'm talking about the transactional nature of the business rather than the philanthropic nature. Have you found it's been a pretty good supplement, and in some cases you found you can just keep in more touch with them, or is it net neutral or negative for you?
Yeah, I think I have in some of the cases where my artisans aren't, in very rural communities where there's no reception anyway. I've been able to stay in touch. So I think I've been, my Italian glass blowers or Japanese candle makers, those sorts of artisans, absolutely. We just have regular Zoom meetings, and that's easy to maintain those relationships and even to do design work together, like co-design stuff. It's very easy that way. Even some of our artisans in Mexico, it's been amazing. But of course, I think there's been a little bit more distance between me and some of these artisans in, rural Africa. Of course. Obviously unable to connect with them. And a lot
harder to find new, right? I mean, it's harder to have someone, be somewhere doing something else and see, that great find, as merchants would call it, as you described it earlier. Someone would bring out some great pottery and you go, wow, that's amazing. That's a bit harder, right? Finding new is a bit harder.
It is. And actually what I'm doing with a lot of our vendors for product is in a lot of these rural areas, they only make what either sells locally, which is very important to sustain and keep, their local market thriving and an economy going on that regard. But also, like in a lot of these areas where there is a little bit of a tourist market attached, these artisans only design for tourists. And so, there's this one basket and that's the one that sells and that's the one that they make. And so for me, what I like to do is get into these communities and say, listen, what other ideas do you have? I'm willing to give you a sample budget in order to explore your the other side of you. Like, what other creative ideas do you have? And not saying, hey, I need this designed and bringing a sample. I just open it up and say, let's design, not even together. You design, here's a sample budget and explore. And so then, there's a little bit of this gap. It's like, it would be great for me to go into those villages and see all of these different things that they've made and then be able to build off of it. Right. And I've been able to do that in Mexico successfully because we've been able to stay connected through Zoom, or, it's easy enough for them to send me the samples and away we go. But some incredible pieces and product have come out of it that way when there's no restrictions put on these artisans.
That's a very savvy approach. I love that idea of giving them a budget and saying, because I can see exactly what you're saying, right? Listen, this sells. I can't take a risk on building anything else because this is what people here, tourists, seem to like. But wow, that's such a great idea. Give them a sample budget and unleash their creativity that's probably just sitting there bottled up, so to speak. Now, I just one last question. So you're talking about Japan and Italy. So clearly all the products are not exactly from artisans who are struggling, communities that are struggling and that need help, but are all original. So how do you think about that from a merchandising strategy perspective? Like when you articulate that out as your brand, is your brand more impact driven and artisanal, or how do you pull those two things together as you articulate what you are, website or just as you articulate to me and to the listeners here?
Right. Well, actually, I don't think there should be division between artisans, no matter what part of the world you're from, whether you're a glass blower from Italy who's super well established, or you're a wood carver from Mali in a northern rural village that I've found. I think the idea is that you've made this by hand, you've invested your life skills, your talents, your culture. Like some of this has been passed down through generations. And for me, just because it comes from a rural village and a little community doesn't mean that it's worth less than a beautiful piece of glass from Italy. So, I kind of did this social experiment. I came home with wooden bowls and I said to some consumers, hey, how much would you pay for this bowl? I'm just trying to set the retail price of this. And they said, oh, where's it from? I said, oh, it's from northern Mali, Africa. Oh, I'd pay, $30, $40. And I'm like, okay, great. Thank you. And then I asked someone else, hey, how much would you pay for this bowl? Oh, where's it from? It's from Canada. Oh, I'd pay $300, $400 for it. I'm like, okay. So I'm like, okay, that really made it quite clear to me that, they thought that it was worth less. And I guess it's because they think I maybe paid less, right? But for me...
Is that it? Or are consumers a little more, well, if I should be paying less for something made somewhere else because they don't need as much money to get by? Is there...
It could be that. It's also, I think, a little bit of this misconception of how it's made. And so part of my mandate as a company is to be able to keep everyone on an equal level and keep the value of the product based on the amount of skill and talent and craft and culture and everything that went into it, the amount of time that is involved in making some of these pieces. And
reflected in the price point. So I get, do you have an average price point or a scale, good, better, best? I mean, if you were a merchant, we'd be talking about good, better, best items in your assortment. Do you think that way? Do you hit magic price points? Do you? Interesting in this formula.
Based on, all the artisans set their own prices. In the rural communities, of course, so half of my artisans are purpose driven and half of them are very well established, and purpose driven meaning my foundation's involved in some way. So even though in a rural village in Uganda, I won't pay $150 for a bowl, because if I did that, that entire village would stop selling locally. They would stop farming. They would stop beekeeping. So I can pay the local price defined by the artisan, but then I invest all of my net proceeds back into growing and expanding through the foundation.
Through the foundation. So you don't want to distort the economy, so to speak, the microeconomy of where you work. So, that's interesting that you tie those two together. That's very, very clever, very smart. Last couple of questions. So I can't have you on the mic without asking you, and this may be an unfair question, do you have any favorites in your assortment? Is there anything that you just, oh my God, I got to tell you about right now that you love? I mean, sometimes that's a little bit about picking your favorite kid, but is anything jump out that you could point the listeners to when they go visit your site? Do you say, listen, if you're going to look at a couple of three things, maybe you should look at these?
Yeah, I mean, everything is so beautiful, and it's why I'm really grateful and lucky to be working with all of these talented makers from around the world. But of course, me being very philanthropic driven and coming with a development background, my favorites are these artisans that I've been able to work with over a longer period of time, and we've been able to watch their business grow. I've got a jewelry maker from Kenya named Sylvester, and he's been able to hire 2 new staff since we started working with him. And, I'm on WhatsApp with him, 3-4 times a week. It's like they're extended members of our Obakki family. Amadou, I love. He's the wooden bowl maker from Mali. He's reinvesting some money back into reforestation in the regions. I think it's, these Akaliba potters. These are women that have made these bowls in northern Uganda really for generations. They've learned on the knees of their grandmothers, on the knees of their grandmothers. It just kind of keeps going through. And they're incredibly talented artisans that are really just wanting to use their own 2 hands to create change for themselves and to sustain their village. And so for me, it's those artisans that, I'm deeply connected to. I'm not saying their product is better than the others, but yeah, the story's there. There's actually a story behind every one of our products, so it is hard to choose.
Well, it's fantastic. So I guess my last question is, where can people go to learn more about you and learn more about your retail concept and tell me about all that stuff?
Right. Yeah. So we are in Vancouver. So we have a little showroom here where people can come by and, people will come in and say, oh, it's almost like coming to a global kind of art gallery because you actually get a tour all the way through our showroom and how each person made everything. So it's kind of a fun little experiential outing. But we are online, obakki.com, Obakki, and we also have Obakki Foundation. So if you want to read about the impact, it's all kind of there as well.
Well, Treana, it's been such a treat hearing both your origin story and the great work you're doing and the savviness of your merchandising, because you've picked, I think you were purpose-driven, but you've certainly picked a complicated retail concept that takes a lot of skill and passion to execute. So I wanted to wish you congratulations and wish you continued success in everything you're doing. And thank you for joining me on The Voice of Retail.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode of The Voice of Retail. Be sure and follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy podcasts so you don't miss out on the latest episodes, industry news, and insights. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating review, as it really helps us grow so that we continue to get amazing guests onto the show. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of Emmy LeBlanc Company, Inc., and if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at emmyleblanc.co. Until next time, stay safe, have a great week.